Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Thank you all for being here this afternoon. This really important discussion. We're very happy, privileged to have Mya Shone come here and speak about a book of the hidden history of Zionism. I just finished the book recently, and I was kind of in shock. The book is so powerful and so incisive and so contemporary. It was written in the late 1980s. Actually, I think they were writing it in the early 1980s, and yet it could have been written yesterday, given what's going on in that region now. I think it's an extraordinarily important book, and I hope everybody who can read it because it really will inform you. And there's books at the table for sale. So I really urge you and encourage you to get that book, to read it, to absorb the knowledge there, because it's so important in terms of understanding what's going on right now. It's shocking, really, to think about how long it's taken for the reality of Zionism to begin to filter out into this society. But anyway, I'll let Mya really get into that. I'm not going to get into that, but I do want to make a couple of announcements before we begin the program. This is what we call, this afternoon session is what we call Global Conversations. It's sort of like the afternoon version of Morning Forum. And Jeff, who's our leader in the Morning Forum, is here. The Morning Forum, I just want to make a couple of announcements for you here, just while we're here, to let you know that the next Morning Forum, which will be next week, next Sunday morning, is going to be on the issue of zero waste and Recology. And Robert Reed, who's the Recology's public relations manager, will be here. So an opportunity to get into that question, which is something that a lot of people are interested in. It's an important one. And then the week after that, on April 25th, Peace and Freedom Party candidates for governor, state controller, and superintendent of public instruction will be here. So those are two forums coming up. These are morning forums, not afternoon, 9:30 in the morning. Okay, so I just wanted to, when I recently put out a call for this meeting, for an email about this meeting, I got a response from someone that I know. Her name is Lori Weinstock, and she wrote a statement. She gave me the permission to read here about this forum, the book, The Hidden History. So I'm going to read her statement, and then I'm going to bring up Millie to introduce Mya. Okay. This is Lori Weinstock's comment. It is interesting to read as I lived in Israel, Palestine through much of what is written about. I lived in Israel most of the years between 1971 and 1990, from age 15 till 34. In the early 1970s, many of us still hoped that the occupation would end and some kind of peace might be achieved. But this was a mirage. Every day, the centrist labor government was building Jewish settlements in the West Bank and Gaza Strip, the Golan Heights, and Sinai. Setting up these settlements was a part of the regular Israeli army service. My closest friends and I were part of the Army Settlement Division called Nahal in 1974 and 75. Of course, this only got worse when the right wing came to power in the late 1970s. On June 5, 1982, I was at a demonstration against the then 15-year occupation. Fighter jets flew over our heads that evening, and we were informed that Israel was invading Lebanon. At least 20,000 Lebanese and Palestinians died in that invasion. The Sabra and Shatila massacre happened in 1982. This is where military drones were pioneered. In 1983, I remember Raphael Eitan, the head of the Israeli armed forces, made headlines with his overtly dehumanizing statement about the West Bank, saying, "When we have settled the land, all the Arabs will be able to do is scurry about like drugged cockroaches in a bottle." Could the Nazis have been more grotesque in their description of Jews? But this only revealed a truth that Israeli Jews tried to hide from themselves and the outside world. The destruction and dehumanization of the Palestinians as a people always was at the core of their actions and their political design. They refused to acknowledge the Palestinians as a people then, and to this day, even almost always continue to call them simply the Arabs, both in casual conversation and official statements. So that's from Lori. So I'm going to ask Millie Phillips to come up here. I want to thank Millie for bringing to our attention this book and for inviting Mya to come here and speak. And Millie will say a few more words about Mya, and then Mya will come up. So thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. Yeah, I'm Reverend Millie Phillips. I'm affiliated community minister with this congregation, and I will also be facilitating the question and answer part following the forum. There's cards that have been distributed. You can write your question on a card. I or someone else will come and collect those, and we'll read those, and then Mya can answer those questions and address those comments. Okay, I want to say a few things about Mya. Mya Shone has been involved for more than 4 decades in the Palestinian struggle for self-determination. She has written, broadcast, and lectured extensively, as well as coordinated campaigns. She has been a communications director for unions, as well as nonprofit organizations, along with having been a filmmaker and a radio broadcaster. I have known and worked with Mya on labor and human rights issues for over 30 years, so it is my pleasure to bring Mya to our UU Global Conversations today. Welcome, Mya Shone.
Good afternoon, everyone. I want to first thank Millie and the Human Rights Working Group here at UU for inviting me to speak about the prescient book, The Hidden History of Zionism by Ralph Schoenman, which I co-authored with Ralph. I also want to thank Bruce, who I'm so glad to meet today. And I've read about the work, I've read his articles, I've heard about him, and finally I get to meet him. And thank you, Bruce, for that amazing introduction. Given Israel's repeated genocidal actions and assaults, you may wonder, as Bruce asked, does Zionism still have a hidden history? And is it important to read this book? Yes, as Bruce said. It remains important to understand the goals and methods of Zionism. Why this is not an issue of self-determination for two peoples. Why the Zionist state of Israel should not be conflated with people of Jewish heritage. And lastly, how a militarily strong Israel and suppression of the Palestinian people are essential to the goals of US imperialism. Zionism and the Palestinian struggle are not abstract issues for me. As a young girl, I couldn't comprehend how the world stood silently by as the Nazis imposed anti-Jewish laws and implemented the final solution. Never again wasn't a slogan for me. It was an imperative. But it wasn't until June 1982, when Israel dropped massive tonnages of bombs on Beirut and invaded southern Lebanon, that I personally realized that while Israel claimed to act defensively to ensure Jewish safety, like the colonization of America, Israel was founded upon and engages in wholesale destruction of other people. In Lebanon, the West Bank, Gaza, and Israel itself, along with my late husband, Ralph Schoenman, I experienced firsthand the logic of Zionist perfidy. Children dying from phosphorus burns, men, women, and youth missing limbs because of cluster bombs. Palestinian refugee camps such as Ein Helway leveled to the ground. Young men beaten and tortured. And indelibly, the massacres in Sabra and Shatila, where both Ralph and I spent over 5 days interviewing survivors and photographing the massacred bodies. From these searing experiences came my unshakable commitment to understand and expose the nature of Zionism. 4 overriding myths have shaped the consciousness of most people in our society about Zionism and Israel's relentless campaign to seize all of Palestine and beyond. The first is that of a land without a people, for a people without a land. This myth was cultivated by early Zionists to promote the fiction that Palestine was a remote, desolate place ready for the taking. This claim was quickly followed by the denial of Palestinian identity, nationhood, or legitimate entitlement to the land in which the Palestinian people have lived throughout their recorded history. The second is the myth of Israeli democracy. Innumerable newspaper stories or television references still to this day refer to the Israeli state as the only, quote, real democracy in the Middle East. In fact, as all of you here in this audience understand, Israel is an apartheid state. Civil liberties, due process, and the most basic human rights are by law denied to those who do not meet its religious criteria. The third myth is that of security as the motor force of Israeli foreign policy. Zionists maintain that their state must be the 4th largest military power in the world because Israel has been forced to defend itself and its very existence from hate-consumed Arab masses, the Palestinians foremost among them. The fourth myth is that of Zionism as the moral legatee of the victims of the Holocaust. This is at once the most pervasive and insidious of the myths about Zionism. Ideologues for the Zionist movement have wrapped themselves in the collective shroud of the 6 million Jews who fell victim to the Nazi mass murder. The bitter and cruel irony of this false claim is that the Zionist movement itself actively colluded with Nazism from its inception. I'd like you to look, I had made maps that I presented here, and I hope they've been distributed. As they say, pictures are worth 1,000 words. The first is a map of Greater Israel as presented by the early Zionists. It's been the driving force of Israeli policy and is agreed upon and expressly stated by both Israel's ruling as well as opposition parties. The second page shows maps of Palestine in the modern era. In 1917, there were only 60,000 Jews living in Palestine. The majority of Jews lived in Eastern Europe, particularly within the borders of the Russian Empire. The amount of land settled by Jews in Palestine is even too minimal to show up on the 1917 map. Today, though, there are 7 million Jews controlling all of Palestine and occupying most of it. This is the result of pernicious waves of seizure and settlement. As for the Palestinians, there are 7 million remaining of the many Palestinians in the world who are squeezed into ever-shrinking non-contiguous towns and villages. Of these, 80% of the 2.2 million residents of the little strip of Gaza, and 80% of them are refugees. And 900,000, 30% of those in the West Bank, of the Palestinian population there, are refugees too, forced by the Zionists from their ancestral homes. So let's go to the details. First, myth 1, a land without a people for a people without a land. Genetic evidence shows that Palestinians carry substantial ancestry, up to 87% in some studies, from the early Bronze Age inhabitants of the region, particularly the Canaanites, who settled the area 3000 BCE. That is more than 5,000 years from today. But what of the Jews and their ties to the land? According to the Old Testament, Abraham and his nephew Lot set out from Ur in Mesopotamia. That is modern-day Iraq, 400 miles from Palestine, somewhere between 2000 and 1700 BCE. In other words, 1,000 or more years later than the acknowledged recognition of the Canaanites having been there. They had a mandate, according to the Old Testament, from God to seize the land from the Kenites, the Kenizzites, the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, the Rephaites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Girgashites, and lastly, the Jebusites, all peoples inhabiting the region, to drive them out. And according to your reading of Genesis, to exterminate them. Many hundreds of years later, the short-lived United Kingdom of Israel was formed, only to split apart after the death of Solomon in 928 BCE. The separate kingdoms of Judea in the south and Israel, also known as Samaria, in the north, remained until the Assyrians captured Judea in 721 BCE and the Babylonians seized control of Israel, Samaria, in 586 BCE. There are also too many invasions and conquests to enumerate, but among them are the Philistines, the Persians, the Greeks, the Macedonians, the Ptolemies of Egypt, the Seleucids of Syria, the Roman Empire, which we all know, and the European Crusaders, who controlled Palestine for over 200 years until they were defeated by the Kurdish general Saladin in 1187. By 1516, Palestine, however, was incorporated into the Ottoman Empire until its control of the wide swaths of the Middle East were dissolved during World War I. It is important to note that through all these invasions and conquer of the historic Palestine, the Canaanites, that is, the Palestinian people, remained steadfast, remained in place, even while many other peoples flowed through and temporarily controlled the region. What is so valuable about this 10,400 square miles that is historic Palestine and reaches from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea? Aside from its fertile valleys, Palestine was the sacred bridge, essential for the trade route of spices and other precious commodities, from Asia. Camelback caravans plied their way from southern Arabia to the port of Gaza for shipment to Europe. Let's turn now to the modern era and why the State of Israel was created. By the turn of the 19th century, there were over 1,000 villages and numerous major towns, Nazareth, Hebron, Jerusalem, Acre, you can name so many, in Palestine. Agriculture flourished with citrus orchards, olive groves, and the grains of Palestine known throughout the world. In fact, it was precisely the social cohesiveness and stability of Palestinian society which led British Lord Palmerston in 1840 to propose the founding of a European Jewish settler colony to, quote, preserve the larger interests of the British Empire, end quote. This was the opportunity Britain thought lay before it when it was awarded control over Palestine after the defeat of the Ottoman Empire in World War I. But Britain underestimated the struggle of the Palestinian people, the indigenous people, for self-determination. It was confronted with uprisings in Jerusalem in 1920, Jaffa in 1921, Hebron in 1929, and a 6-month general strike in 1936, from which a 3-year armed struggle evolved. It was at this point that the British Empire turned to Zionist terrorist squads, the few settlers, and integrated them with British intelligence. 12,000 men were organized by the British from the Haganah, the labor Zionists, and 3,000 from Vladimir Jabotinsky's national military organization, the Irgun. As you see, Zionism's quest for greater Israel is foundational. As you can see, labor Zionists, Irgun, Betar, name them all. It's foundational to the ideology of all sectors of what was then a fringe Zionist movement, revisionist and labor alike. We have heard much from the revisionists such as Jabotinsky and the people who followed, like Netanyahu himself, whose father was an aide and secretary to Vladimir Jabotinsky. We have heard so much from these people, but what of the labor Zionists, those who distorted socialist ideals? Let's hear from them. In 1936, David Ben-Gurion, a leader of the labor Zionists, revered as the father of the Israeli state and its first prime minister, he wrote to his son, quote, "A partial Jewish state is not the end, it's only the beginning." And he explained what he meant in 1938 during a speech. He said, the boundaries of Zionist aspiration include southern Lebanon, southern Syria, today's Jordan, all of Cisjordan, that's the West Bank, as it was called then, and the Sinai. Now, this is in addition to Palestine itself. In 1940, Joseph Weitz, the head of the Jewish Agency's colonization department, another labor Zionist, described what this would entail. How is it going to take place? Quote, "Between ourselves, it must be clear that there is no room for both peoples in this country. There is no other way than to transfer the Arabs from here to neighboring countries," end quote. And this is just what they did, systematically expelling the indigenous Palestinian people through a series of genocidal operations before as well as after the United Nations partition of Palestine over the heads of the Palestinian people and against their desires on November 29, 1947, such that 80% of Gaza's 2.2 million people are refugees, 30% of the West Bank's, and 3 million Palestinians were expelled and reside in Jordan and Syria and Lebanon, respectively, with millions more spread throughout the world in diaspora. So let's just remind you of a little bit of the history, which I think most of you know already, but a little reminder. The Nakba, the Zionist massacres that led to the expulsion of 800,000 Palestinians and seizure of their land and properties. The Israeli-created war in June 1967, and let there be no doubt, this was an Israeli-created war, in which the West Bank, Gaza, and Golan Heights were seized from Jordan, Egypt, and Syria, respectively. The series of invasions of Lebanon, not just the current one or 1982, there were many before, along with an 18-year occupation of southern Lebanon, which Israel today has acknowledgedly said it is going to do again, and not only occupy, but incorporate as part of Israel. 500,000 Jewish settlers in the West Bank, 220,000 in East Jerusalem and the land surrounding it, with many outposts to create more settlements themselves. Add to this the brutality of Israel's occupation of the West Bank and Gaza, including the torture and imprisonment of 1 million Palestinians since 1967. Let's look at Gaza, too. The 16-year siege and periodic bombardment of Gaza, preceding the last assault, which has transformed Gaza into an endless sea of rubble as far as the eye can see. Can we speak of this relentless genocide? And there's no other way to describe it. And Israeli historians themselves do so too. They call it genocide. Without asking ourselves, could this have occurred without US sponsorship and funding? I'll repeat, could this have occurred without US sponsorship and funding? Have no illusion. The US rulers and their sponsorship and the funding of the Israeli state bear no relationship to combating anti-Semitism. And I could give you chapter and verse about this historically if we had more time. The close ties between the US and Israel flow directly, and I'll repeat, flow directly from the rise of Arab nationalism in the 1950s. Control of oil and other resources, and the fear then of Soviet hegemony in the region. US rulers stepped in to transform Israel into the linchpin of US imperialist policy in the Middle East only after Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal in 1956. Moshe, you don't have to take it from me. Moshe Sharet, a former prime minister of Israel, director of the Jewish Agency's political department, and also serving at another time as foreign minister, stated this clearly in his diaries, which were later published. Quote, "The US is interested in toppling Nasser's regime, but it does not dare at the moment use the methods it adopted to topple the leftist government of Jacobo Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954 and of Mossadegh in Iran in 1953. It prefers its work to be done by Israel." End quote. These are the words of Moshe Sharet, former Prime Minister of Israel. Let's skip myth 2, the myth of Israeli democracy, because I think everyone in this room would agree that Israel is an apartheid state. But let us always remember that what distinguishes Zionism from other colonial movements is that the avowed purpose is not just to merely exploit the Palestinian people, the indigenous people, but to disperse and dispossess them. So let's move to myth 3, security as the motor force of Israeli policy. This is timely with Israel's recent attacks on both Lebanon and Iran, and its ongoing attacks on Syria, Iraq, and other countries of the region. Returning to the diaries of Moshe Sharet, remember, we're using the words of Israeli leaders themselves. Sharet documents a long-standing program of Israel's leaders from both labor and Likud to expel the Palestinians. But also, he states explicitly, quote, to dismember the Arab world, defeat the Arab national movement, and create puppet regimes under regional Israeli power, end quote. He states explicitly that Israeli political and military leadership, again, whether labor or Likud, whether so-called socialists or revisionists, never believed in any danger to Israel. They sought to maneuver and force the Arab states into military confrontations, which the Zionist leadership were certain of winning, so Israel could carry out the destabilization of Arab regimes and the planned occupation of additional territory. 3 years later, in 1982, while the advanced preparations were being completed for the invasion of Lebanon and the massacre of Palestinians in the camps around Beirut, Sidon, and Tyre, a remarkable document was published in Directions, the journal of the Department of Information of the World Zionist Organization. Let's be clear, the Zionists have no problem stating their goals and intent and actions openly. Its author, Oded Inon, was formally attached to the foreign ministry. So this document reflects high-level thinking in the Israeli military and intelligence establishment. The document, called A Strategy for Israel in the 1980s, is relevant today. It outlines a timetable for Israel to become an imperial regional power based upon the dissolution of the Arab states. Yinon contends that the Arab nations are a fragile shell waiting to be scattered into multiple fragments. This will always be feasible, he argues, because the Muslim world, the Muslim Arab world, and this is not only in the Middle East, but also in North Africa, is built upon a temporary house of cards put together by foreigners, France and Britain in the 1920s, without the wishes and desires of the inhabitants having been considered. It was arbitrarily divided into 19 states, all made of combinations of minorities and ethnic groups which are hostile to one another, so that every Arab Muslim state nowadays faces ethnic social destruction from within, and in some, a civil war is already raging, as we saw the protracted civil war in Lebanon, which was set up by the French as a confessional state, and we saw the US create the dissolution of the Iraqi nation into 3 separate entities, basically. And also we've seen Yemen between North and South, Sudan in North Africa. What emerges clearly from Oded Inon's strategic analysis is that for the Zionist movement, everything is on a timetable, Each area, be it Lebanon or Syria, which is also being broken apart, marked for conquest or reconquest and perceived as a target of opportunity, awaiting only the proper relations of forces and the cover of war. Lastly, myth 4, Zionism is the moral legatee of the victims of the Holocaust. Zionism had always been a fringe movement in Europe. I'll repeat, it was a fringe movement. There was anti-Semitism, but was Zionism the way to address it? No, that was not the thinking of the majority of Jews. Zionism's founders despaired of combating anti-Semitism and paradoxically regarded the anti-Semites themselves as allies because they had a shared desire to remove the Jews from the countries in which they lived. Approaches were made by the Zionists to the Tsarist rulers, the Sultan of Turkey, the Kaiser in Germany, as well as both French imperialism and, as I mentioned, the British Raj. Not only by Theodor Herzl, the founder of Zionism, but by Chaim Weizmann, president of the Zionist organization, who would become the first president of Israel. But the sordid history, the long sordid history, long suppressed, is the collaboration of the Zionists with Mussolini and with the Nazis. And this, I will say, I can only go into briefly here. There's much of it in The Hidden History of Zionism and in Lenny Brenner's important book, Zionism in the Age of the Dictators. Soon, the Zionist Federation of Germany, as early as June 21st, 1933, sent a memorandum of support to the Nazi Party. But soon afterwards, the entire World Zionist Organization at its Congress defeated a resolution calling for action against Hitler. During this very Congress, Hitler announced a trade agreement with the World Zionist Organization's Anglo-Palestine Bank, breaking thereby the Jewish boycott that many Jews in Europe had called for against the Nazi regime. And remember, this was the height of the Depression, when the German economy was extremely vulnerable, and this boycott would have made a difference. The collaboration didn't stop there, though. The World Zionist Organization would become the principal distributor of Nazi goods throughout the Middle East and Northern Europe. It established a bank in Palestine, the Havara, to receive monies from the German Jewish bourgeoisie, with which Nazi goods, the German goods, controlled by the Nazi government at the time, were purchased in substantial quantities. Aside from being of like mind about racial purity, the Zionists saw any effort to rescue Europe's Jews as a threat to their entire movement. Throughout the late 30s and 40s, Jewish spokesperson in Europe cried out for help, for public campaigns, for organized resistance to the Nazis, for demonstrations to force the hand of Allied governments, be it France, be it Britain, be it the United States itself, only to be met not merely by Zionist silence, but by active Zionist sabotage. I'm going to give you two examples. As late as 1943, while the Jews of Europe were being exterminated in the millions, and it was known to the Allied powers that this was taking place, the US Congress proposed to set up a commission to, quote, study the problem. Rabbi Stephen Weiss, important in Los Angeles particularly, who was the principal American spokesperson for Zionism, came to Washington to testify against the rescue bill because it would divert attention from the colonization of Palestine. The culmination of Zionist betrayal, however, the most egregious example, was the sacrifice of Hungary's Jews in a series of agreements between the Zionist movement and Nazi Germany. This only became known in 1953 through the heroic efforts of someone who was then brought to trial in Israel. Dr. Rudolf Kastner of the Jewish Agency Rescue Committee in Budapest signed a secret pact with Adolf Eichmann to, quote, settle the Jewish question in Hungary. This took place in 1944. The pact sealed the fate of 800,000 Jews who went to the gas chambers. It was to be revealed later that Kastner, under the direction of the Zionist leaders abroad, when he made this agreement with Eichmann. I'll repeat, it was revealed and it was substantiated by the Supreme Court in Israel that Kastner was acting under the direction of the Zionist leaders abroad when he made this agreement with Eichmann for the death of 800,000 Hungarian Jews. The agreement entailed the saving of merely 600 prominent Jews on the condition that the Zionists maintained the silence about what they knew was going to be the fate of Hungarian Jewry. Let me close by considering a way forward. We don't want to just look at history, we want to look forward. We in the United States must demand, as has all of you in the Unitarian Church, an end to all aid to Israel. I also contend, as do a growing number of others, both in the Palestinian movement, as has been the Palestinian statements from a long time, as among a growing number of Israeli Jews, that a state is not coextensive with its people, that the only way forward for the peoples of this region is the replacement of the Zionist Israeli state. There is no two states. There are no two peoples. With a unitary Palestine extending from the river to the sea. This would be a democratic and secular society, just as we demand for ourselves. And as anyone with any notion of democracy demands for all peoples of the world. Why is there an exception for Israel? Why is there this indecent exceptionalism? What is the form of this unitary, democratic and secular society, which we have to add has the right of return for the millions of Palestinian refugees? The form of it would be decided by convening a constituent assembly, which is not something new to history. It has taken place in nation after nation. If not, it is really apparent to me, as it is to, I think, all of you, but most importantly, it's also apparent to Israeli and US rulers that the only alternative is permanent genocidal war. And as we see from reading the newspapers, this is exactly what the Israeli government is preparing for. And as what we know from US military budgets, this is what the US government is preparing for too. Thank you. So Time for what I hope will be a very lively and informative discussion. The what? I didn't mention the Balfour Declaration. I assume everyone here knows of the Balfour 1917, which is why I discussed what Palestine looked like in 1917. But the Balfour Declaration is in keeping with what, as I said about Lord Palmerston, was on the part of the British, it would create a colonial outpost to serve the interests of the empire. Go ahead, no.
Thank you. So I'm going to read off some of the questions that people have asked. Hopefully we'll have time for all of them. There are quite a few, so it's good. We are getting a good, lively discussion. The first one here is, do you think AIPAC is responsible for the U.S. interests in supporting Israel's aims to move Arabs out of Palestine? And what can we do about this?
Okay. So AIPAC, everybody knows what AIPAC is, correct? Okay, well, AIPAC it has nonprofit status, but it is essentially the Zionist lobby in the United States. It also has a political PAC. You know, as the Supreme Court has ruled, you can have dark money, and AIPAC has its dark money wing, where it intentionally goes and wages large campaigns against anyone who speaks in favor of the Palestinian people, as we saw with Jamal Bowman losing his position in Congress, and others have done that. But this has been going on for a long time. It isn't necessarily Democrats. They went against Paul Finley long ago in the South Bay. Anyone, and he wrote a book called They Dare to Speak Out. That was in the 1980s, so forth. So the issue of AIPAC is again, even though it was given nonprofit status, is a reflection of the Zionist lobby in the United States. And it spends hundreds of millions of dollars to put into office people who will serve its interests. It's not just AIPAC. There are other organizations, as everyone here has seen, with on campuses. There are now huge internet sites with anyone who speaks out in favor of the Palestinian people, and pressure to get students kicked out of school, professors fired, people chased out of their workplace, such as Google or elsewhere in the tech industry. So this is, you know, a lot of money. But I will not say it's a mischaracterization to say that AIPAC drives US policy. You have to, what I'm trying to tell you here today is that Israel serves US interests in the region. And that the US rulers, they didn't fund Israel. It was the French who originally funded the original Israeli state, provided it with arms. And actually, the Zionists bought their first arms from Czechoslovakia. So the US didn't get interested until the rise of Arab nationalism. And this is still the interest of the United States. Look at what was done in Iraq. Look at what was done in Iran. Look what was done in Syria. Look what's done in Egypt. In order to get Egypt off the table, the US fund, after Camp David, the US gives Egypt almost as much money as it gives Israel in order to keep Egypt out of the wave of Arab nationalism. It funds its military structures to suppress the Egyptian people.
We have a lot of questions. Might not be able to get to.
My answers.
Might not be able to get to all of them. A few of the cards came in early on in the presentation, and which she has already answered the questions. So a few of them. So I might not go into detail with those. But here's another question: how did the Zionists win support from the British for the Zionist state in Palestine?
Okay, so this would get into the history of how there was the Balfour Declaration. Originally, the British, they were trying to play both sides. But what they eventually did during the mandate is that you had to have a license to have a business. You had to, which they gave to Jews rather than to Palestinians. Palestinians were chased out of their workplaces in various factories. There's a long story. A lot of it is in the Hidden History of Zionism, so I won't take the time here. But the Israelis convinced themselves, Chaim Weizmann in particular, in England, put a full court press to say, we will serve your interests in the region. We will serve the interests of Great Britain. But they had tried this with the worst of the anti-Semitic people under the Tsarist regime, such as Simon Petkiva, who led the pogroms. They tried this with the Sultan. They tried it with the Kaiser. They found a little reception in Great Britain, which itself had anti-Semitic policies at the time. So
there was a question here related to your comments about Rabbi Stephen Weizmann, I think you actually answered that, but the person wanted to know if you could comment on how the Zionists in this country were won to this position. You know, like why were they influenced by it?
There's always a fringe movement of people who say, let us not struggle against oppression. Maybe we can go and move somewhere else, right? You saw this even with the Black Liberation Movement. You had the Back to Africa movement, rather than fighting for a struggle against segregation and for racial equality here in the United States. At one point, there was a movement in the United States to separate off a good part of the South and make that a Black nation, because that's where the majority of the Black population lived until the Great Migration. So these are ways of thinking. They're not ways of thinking that deal with the inherent issues of struggle, of what it means for people to struggle for rights and equality and to live together in harmony, to acknowledge that we're people. It doesn't matter what our religion is. It doesn't matter what our race is. We are all people. And this was the issue. It was a big debate. This is a debate that went throughout a good part of the 1800s and the 1900s among Jews. And most Jews rejected it. They wanted to live in Europe. They just didn't want an anti-Semitic attack on them. So how do you do that? You must struggle. You must overthrow the anti-Semitic repressive governments. That's how you do it. It's basic. People have to struggle for their rights. You can't live separately. So what you end up with the Jews creating is what the colonists did here with the genocidal approach to the Native Americans. Wipe them out until there's just a remnant few.
Little different topic here. Please compare and contrast the Israeli government assaults on Palestinians versus assault on Hezbollah and the difference in goals of these groups regarding Israel.
Okay. So briefly, because this is an entire discussion of the Middle East, because it also relates to how Hamas was formed. Hezbollah did not exist until the Israeli occupation of southern Lebanon in 1982. It did not exist. Hamas did not exist and before 1988, with the suppression of the First Intifada and the relentless destruction of the Palestine Liberation Organization. What are the Shiite population, the majority population of southern Lebanon, who are very poor and have been dispossessed with the French creation of a confessional Lebanon with by religious structure. If you look at how Lebanon is, the constitution of Lebanon, you think it's bonkers. The choices of who's prime minister is by religion. How many seats in the Senate? It's all by religion. It's not by people and populations. So when Israel occupied the South, what were the Shiites in the South to do? Were they to accept this occupation? No. People banded together and rebelled, and that led to the formation of Hezbollah. It did not exist prior to that. Hamas, again, and this is another long subject, which came out of the Muslim Brotherhood, did not exist. It did not participate in the First Intifada. But Israel left no opportunity for organizing. It closed all the PLO social services. It arrested. I was in Deheshi camp. Every night, the Israeli soldiers were there coming in and arresting in the 1980s and even later. I'm telling you, there was only one place to organize, and that was in the mosque. The Palestinians were a secular people. They were a secular people. It didn't matter if you were religious or not religious. It didn't matter if you were Christian or if you were Muslim. It is Israel that instilled, I say fomented, this religiosity, this terror upon itself, which it's even obvious to the Western press if you look at reports of how Hamas was created and how Israel let the funding for it flourish. It was to oppose the secular Palestinian movement, the democratic secular Palestinian movement.
The person who wants to ask, where do the settlers, the current settlers come from? Or are they from here or other places? Or?
Okay, that's a discussion in itself, and it's about the different aliyahs, or the immigration to Israel. And I actually have done quite a bit of research about these aliyahs. So just briefly, 1948, you need to populate. There are only 60,000 people. What are you going to do? So part of the aliyahs required the collaboration of the US, Great Britain, France, at the time of World War II, after European Jewry. Where were they going to go? The US had very harsh rules for who it would accept. It's even been found that FDR said he didn't want the Jews from Germany coming in because they might be Nazis, he said in the early days. He couldn't trust them. There were prison camps for Jews that even came up in upper New York State. Britain had very small quota. France, too. Where were people to go? They wanted to come to the United States. So actually, most people ended up in the Soviet Union after World War II. If you look at the numbers, most Jews ended up in the Soviet Union. But how did they get to Israel? From 1948 to the 50s, these now Zionist government created conditions in Iraq. It's been proven there were these terror bombings of the synagogues, and 650,000 Jews came from Iraq, Yemen, and Libya. And, excuse me, Iran too? Okay, and Iran too. Then from 1940, it was called Operation Ezra and Nehemiah. But the biggest infusion, which is 1 million people, came after the breakup of the Soviet Union. And this is where and these people, particularly the Soviet Jews who were highly educated, resourceful, just what the labor Zionists wanted. They brought 1 million Russian Jews to Israel, and they peopled them in what were called development towns across the Negev, East Jerusalem, the major settlement outside East Jerusalem of Ariel, even in the Golan Heights, all throughout the settlements. But how did they do it? Did the Russian Jews really want to come to Israel? They felt no affiliation. They weren't Zionists. They just wanted better lives. There was collaboration with the European governments and with the United States. You could not get a visa to the United States or Europe, and the Austrians too, because people came through Vienna. You could speak to that. You could not get a visa at some point, just like they're doing with the people who are flooding in from South and Central America. You had to get your visa while you were still in Russia, in the Eastern countries. You could not come to Vienna, come to Budapest, and then get a visa to go to any of these European countries, because they had very small quotas. They weren't accepting people. But Israel promised the Russian Jews a big stipend, housing, and immediate citizenship. Plus, there was collaboration where the airplane flights had only went from the European cities to Israel. They didn't fly elsewhere.
Person wants to know what started the war in 1982 with Lebanon.
Okay, this is a whole lecture in itself, and I've given many of them just about the 1982 war in Lebanon and what preceded it. The Israelis called it peace in the Galilee, and they said that they were being attacked by Palestinian resistance movements, and they just had enough. Well, this is what we call a Bubba mice, because that invasion was prepared for many, many, many years, and it wasn't the first of the invasions. It would take just too long. But as many of these things, and as I tried to say, yeah, there might have been a few skirmishes, but not enough to warrant the bombing of Beirut was the equivalent of the atomic bomb that dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. It was relentless, absolutely relentless. And if you look at the pictures of Gaza, you can see what was going on in Beirut. And I was in Ein Helway, and I have to tell you, for 20 days and 20 nights, there was bombardment from the air, from the sea, and then the Israelis came in with bulldozers and leveled that camp where 80,000 people lived. And these were people who had fled from the expulsion in 47. And they lived within Ein Helway, which means sweet spring, in areas that pertained to where they had lived in the Galilee. They maintained the integrity of where they had been, their neighbors. So what could I say? We could talk here today of what was the Iran-Iraq War also. And you may not remember, it took place in 1980, where it was brutal. It was so brutal and devastating that in Iran, they ran out of soldiers. And if remember, they had children who were suited and were on suicide missions to flood against the Iraqis. Well, at the time, this was a war that was provoked by the United States and Israel. And Israel funded the Iranians, and the US funded Iraq with the intention of destroying both nations and bleeding them dry. So there's a long, long history. It's a whole other lecture of what went on in Egypt, what's gone on with attacks on Lebanon periodically, Iraq, Syria, and notably Iran too.
Just a quick question. How much more time do we have? Does anyone, excuse me?
Yeah.
Yeah, go ahead.
You did mention a lot of Jewish came to Israel. They believed in God promising this land. And this is the reason they tried to push the Palestinians out of there. And a lot of the young people, the children of the immigrants, they put them on a white farm. This is the majority of the settlers. They think from the Bible, the problem, the land is they try to push the Palestinians out of there because they say this is our land. This is the conflict between two people.
I did mention this, and this is a discussion, of what you think. Do you think of your God as a real estate agent? Really? Because basically, can a God determine who is going to live where and where? Wars have been created under the mantle of God throughout Europe, throughout Asia, throughout history. Is that really what inspires war? Think about it. It's a struggle for resources. There's no different. It's a struggle for land and resources. And if you actually look at the history, I went and I looked up all these peoples who had inhabited the area. Many of them, even when there were conquests, they integrated into, it's a story of the development of monotheism in a big way, if you look at the Bible and you look at the formation of the Hebrew nation. So it's a long discussion, but I ask you fundamentally, and evangelical Christians such as US Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, is stating the same. He's providing the map of Greater Israel. Can there be a God? Can people believe in a God who's basically a real estate agent?
Well, that's the Christian nationalism. It's not universal to Christianity by any means. There is plenty of opposition within, but there's also about, I think, 20% of Palestinians are Christian, and we've had some Christian speakers from Palestine speak here in the past too.
As I said, to be a Palestinian, the name Palestine evolves from the Philistines and a Greek word, because the Philistines, who were a sea nation, they occupied a good part of Gaza. They were the ancient merchants, seamen, and the mariners. And that's where the name Palestine, it was Canaan before. Yeah.
The Bible is a story about this king, the David. But if you look at Google, they tell you it's a different people. It's not the same people.
I missed that.
We do have some other questions, so people have wrote down on cards, so we can get some of those. We have about 15 minutes, by the way. Okay. So this is a question, the handwriting is a little hard to read, but I'll just I can do best. Have you heard of how the Oslo Accords and Norwegian okay. And it starts off with, have you heard about, and then it lists a bunch of people, Norwegian diplomat Larsen, the king and the prime minister, of their connection to Epstein and Ehud Barak. And the accord as a mask for settlements. I'm not quite sure I'm reading this right, but.
Okay. I've read about it, but I don't pay much attention to it because that wasn't the purpose of the Oslo Accords. Before Oslo, there was Madrid. There was a whole sequence that actually started during the first George Bush administration, which was, how do you neutralize the region? Is it possible to neutralize the region? Is it possible to hold out to the Palestinian that in the by and by they could have their own nation? This has never been, if you look at the Palestinian Charter, the Charter of the Palestine Liberation Organization, it calls for a democratic and secular Palestine for all peoples. They didn't anticipate that there would be waves and waves and waves until there were 7 million Jews. But even so, the call at the time of the partition among the Palestinians was for a democratic and secular Palestine. This has been the position. It has been US imperialism that has set out to preserve its military base in the Middle East with Israel. And how do you pacify the Palestinian people? How do you pacify a people? How do you, especially, when you think about it, this is not new in history. How do you pacify a people? What they did with the Madrid and the Oslo and so forth is to hold out to the Palestinian bourgeoisie that they could have a little bit of territory over which they could govern. But of course, as you know, that was supposed to be demilitarized. It was supposed to have Israeli control over all the borders. It was this, that. It was to set up a very large concentration camp. Well, of course, the Palestinian people themselves don't agree. What's the benefit? What are they going to do? They continue to struggle. And the biggest attack on the Palestinians themselves came from the Palestinian leadership of Yasser Arafat himself. And that was when the first Intifada arose with the stone-throwing youth. That's when most of the people in the world actually stood up and understood the Palestinian people had a right to struggle because they saw all these images of these youth out there demonstrating, being attacked by bulldozers and weaponry. But what happened with the Palestinian people in that first Intifada is that they organized. When the Israelis closed their schools, they opened schools. When the Israelis prevented them from getting food, they created their own collectives and organizations. And they formed a unified leadership of the people themselves that was independent of the collaborationist Palestine Liberation Organization. And that had to be crushed. And that's where the Oslo Accords come into play. So, but that's a very an important and good discussion, because it's a discussion of the struggle of the people for their own society.
Thank you. I need one more question, then the last 4 cards are kind of general things, and I'll just list them to you and see if you have any further comment. The last question here is, do you think Americans now are beginning to realize how harmful the U.S. support for Israel's some policies are, I guess, have been?
Yes. We all know that. I don't have to say much. The polls say 60% of the U.S. population now say the U.S. should not be funding and supporting Israel. And the numbers will grow. What we need to do is to ensure that we have the right to speak. We need to preserve free speech, which is being attacked day by day, not just in the press, not just by state laws, but on very campuses, as I'm sure you're all aware. And this we must really struggle for, because if we can't speak out, we can never make any change in society.
Okay, so the last 4 cards, as I said, are kind of general, but I'll see if you have anything additional you want to add to these. One was the similarities to the Zionist movement against the Palestinians to the struggle of indigenous people here, which you already kind of addressed. Yeah, and whether it was, what role do you think historical anti-Semitism helps in explaining, how these stuff happened, which you more or less addressed. Yeah. What are more examples of collaboration with the Zionists with the Nazis? And it's just read the book. Yeah. But if you have any more you want to add, and also the last one being about the racial theories of the Nazis against the Jews, and how does Zionism's racial kind of views fit with that?
Okay, so again, you can read the Hidden History of Zionism for a synopsis about the Zionist collaboration with the Nazis, and also collaboration with the apartheid regime of South Africa. There was a very close collaboration. And again, if you want more extensive Zionism in the Age of the Dictators by Lenny Brenner is up on the Marxist Internet Archive. You can read it for free in his revised edition. There is a long history, and it's just too much to go into here. That's why I gave you the 2 examples. What was the other?
On the Nazis' racial views of Jews and how the Zionists use racial kind of.
I don't think that really deserves much discussion. They both have a sense of racial purity. It's despicable. If we had lived in that time, we would be out rebelling against Nazism. But what did you see here in the US? You had the collaboration of the big industrialists with the big industrialists in Germany. And after World War II, a lot of the apparatus was kept in place. Not just the apparatus of the higher ups, but the industrial apparatus. When they bombed, they didn't bomb the industries. They bombed people, the Allied forces. They left the industrial apparatus of Germany intact. So you have to look at how capitalism works. Basically, you have to look how the ruling class functions. It's no different back then as it is now.
Okay. So I think that. Thank you. I just want to read one last comment that was sent up here, not a question. It says, please return to give us more lectures on other aspects if you possibly have time.
I want to thank you all. And I also want to thank you for being so steadfast in being out there in the streets and in the campaigns and elsewhere. because I know that you stand for not justice here in the United States, but worldwide. So it's been my special pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Maya. I just want to, and Millie, I just want to remind you that the book is back there. And so it's $10. And I really highly recommend it because Maya, touched on a lot of the issues, but really, like I said, I just got through reading the book and it's really an eye opener, even for someone like me who's read quite a few books, especially the last 3 years about the Zionism and the conflict and all that in that part of the world. It's really an incredibly prescient book in terms of what's going on now. So
I just want to say that the contact information in the book is all wrong. The book was written when we had lived in Santa Barbara, and we're now here. I'm here in the Bay Area. So don't go by that. If you want to be in touch, just ask Millie and she'll put you in touch with me.
you mean the contact in the book? Is that what you're saying?
Well, it says,
Oh.
this is
Oh, okay.